This was early in the spring when you come out, was it? With your fur? After you got it after you got it sold, now, what was the summer? What did the summer look forward to? What was it look forward to when it's coming spring and summer?
Well, when you came back from the spring hunt, usually latter part of March or early April, you faced the busiest time in a trapper's life. It was a time there just didn't seem to be enough time for anything. It was the time of year when you had to cut next winter's firewood. You had to prepare the seal nets for the water. There were boats to be repaired and painted, and there were many other jobs could be done only at this time of the year. And besides all that, you had to find a little time to hunt and fish, for this was the very leanest season of the year, a season when without a bit of fish and game your family would be reduced to a diet of bread and tea only. You spent your first couple of weeks at home after the end of the spring hunt in cutting your firewood, and we measured this locally in terms of the number of sticks of wood we needed for a year's supply, and a winter's supply of fuel for the average-sized trapper's home was roughly 1,000 sticks of a size that could be carried on a man's shoulder. In cords, that would translate to roughly 10 cords of wood, about 100 turns, as we call them, of wood would make up a cord. So you went in the woods with your axe each morning as soon as it got daylight, and you cut, limbed, and piled wood until you had roughly your 10 cords for next year. Once this was cut, you harnessed your dogs and hauled it home. And then you didn't do much more with it until fall, because the other jobs coming up were going to take the rest of the time until breakup. Anybody who kept a team of dogs, as most all of us did, had to get out on the ice during latter half of April and May and hunt seals. And this was fairly good fun. One stalked the seals on the ice and shot them with a rifle at long range. It called for rather good shooting. Or later, after all the snow had thawed off the ice, you made up parties and harpooned the seals when the snow was gone enough so that you could find all their blowholes. And days in the spring that were too cold, too bad weather to be out on the ice sealing, you spent your time perhaps mending or netting, bringing to or barking your seal nets for the seal fishery after the ice broke up and the big seals came in from the open sea. The sealing time, that is the net sealing after the ice had gone out, was in many ways the loveliest time of the year. Tending seal nets in itself is the heaviest kind of work, but it gives the illusion of a leisurely holiday. Rising before dawn in the Labrador June means maybe 2 a.m. Breakfast is hurriedly disposed of and gear stowed in the motorboat. And by 3 o'clock you're on your way out to your net berths with perhaps a couple of small boats in tow. And you have to get at this netting early in the morning because the seal nets are very heavy and awkward to handle, and you can only set them or haul them in calm water. and it's important to do as much as possible in the early morning before the wind rises with the sun. Setting the nets itself is a fairly easy job, provided the wind and tide are cooperative. The seal net's around 45 fathoms, or in other words 270 feet in length by maybe 3 fathoms or 18 feet deep. And it's usually set on the bottom with the shore end in maybe 3.5, 4 fathoms of water, with the outside end running off to maybe 8 or 9 fathoms. In other words, the whole thing's underwater from headline to foot rope. Often when the wind and tide are slack and an even bottom permits it, we join 2 nets together to form what we refer to as a fleet of maybe 500 or 600 feet length. The nets are first laid out on the surface by 2 men in a rowboat, and then going back over them, the weights are attached to sink them to the bottom. At the inshore end of the net, a slender pole, 15 or more feet in length, is moored to the foot rope of the net in such a fashion that it'll float upright with perhaps 1/3 of its length out of water. This is known as the prayer pole, and is the only visible sign of the net when it's finally set, for the net must be far enough under the surface so that boats or heavy drift ice will pass over them without damaging them. Setting 3 fleets of nets, pretty good day's work for 2 men, and the high point of the day came when you'd go ashore after setting and boil the kettle on the beach and lie about for an hour or so watching the seals playing close ashore and speculating as to whether or not there was any bait to make them fish. It's only a seal that's fishing that'll get in a net. A seal that's traveling never will. He travels near the surface, doesn't dive deep enough to get into the nets. The first haul on the seal nets comes the second day after the nets are set. All through the season you'd only tend nets maybe every other day, for in springtime there's so much else to do. You're planting your gardens and building and repairing fences, painting your house, and of course each time the nets are hauled, the seals have to be skinned and the fat pelted off the skins, and the meat and fat salted in barrels for winter dog food. The skins have to be cleaned, stretched, and dried for the making of boots, mitts, dog harness, traces, lash lines, and things of that sort. Hauling the nets was really pretty tough racket, because you soon found out then if you belonged with the men or the boys. Picture, if you can, maybe 500 feet of net to be raised by hand from where it rests on the bottom to the surface of the water. In the net, if you're lucky, there may be perhaps 30 seals at 200-300 pounds weight each. Perhaps the tide setting against the net hard enough to keep everything as tight as a bar. And you work from a light rowboat on the lowered side of the nets, the weight of which keep your boat down on her side so that any little wave splashes aboard and frequent bailing's necessary. If it's dead calm, your boat will carry maybe a dozen seals, the weight of which will bring her gunnels down to within an inch or 2 of the water. When she's loaded, you must go alongside your motorboat and transfer the catch to her before going back for more. This too must be done by hand, and if anything can be harder to lift from one boat over the high side of another than a 300-pound seal, it's slippery and apparently boneless, I've yet to make its acquaintance. If the weather holds calm long enough and the seals are plentiful enough, can be dawned a dark job to clear out a couple of fleets of nets, and the next day will be a busy and messy one, clearing away the carcasses. The skinning and pelting the seals is a good deal less laborious, but seems much harder, for there's no sort of picnic atmosphere as there is in setting or hauling nets.
We have 5 minutes.
Skinning a seal takes an expert only maybe 3 to 5 minutes. The fat's taken off the carcass on the skin and later removed from it in one piece with a very sharp knife. Spring, when the seals are fat, 4 pelts will yield a barrel of fat and 3 carcasses a barrel of meat. Right in the middle of all this activity with seals comes to planting of gardens. It's strange to me how many people right here on the base seem to think that in Labrador you can't grow anything because of sand and frost, etc. But we've found that in Labrador you can grow nearly any flower or vegetable can be grown in Nova Scotia. It may take more effort to do so, and it mightn't be worth trying to raise too many of them on a commercial scale. But it's easy enough to raise everything you need for family use. Our own gardens yield us an ample supply of winter-keeping vegetables such as potatoes, turnips, cabbage, beets, and carrots. Besides these, we have all the summer green food we need: salad greens, green peas, string beans, kale, chard, and many others. We have ripened both corn and tomatoes in our gardens, but I must admit they usually do get killed by frost before they're mature. By the time the sealing's over and the gardens are planted and ready for the first weeding, June's pretty near gone. And before we became so sophisticated, the trapper now had to make up his mind whether he was going to spend the summer on the coast at the cod fishery or have a season catching salmon. We had been coming across for nearly 3 weeks, across a near barren stretch from Little Seal Lake to Snakemo, and we'd had no game at all. We'd been living on flour, and not much of that since we were on short rations. We'd crossed an arm of the lake, and we'd been very cautious and paddled way up around the arm not to have to cross a wide stretch in the rough water. And running down more or less before the wind on the other side of the arm, along the ice foot, or ballicatter as we call it locally, we spotted 2 white partridges, ptarmigan I think they're correctly known as. And of course we had to have these. So Uncle Archie was elected by a clear majority of 2 to get ashore and execute them for supper. And he scrambled out of the canoe, and it was a rocky shoreline there below the ice foot, and I had to shove the canoe off again, keep her off the rocks, or she'd have pounded a hole in herself. With Archie's weight out of the forward part of the canoe, and she settled a bit more by the stern. Before I could get her head up into the wind, she just swamped from behind, and I went overboard into 10 feet of the coldest water in history. And I was sort of bobbing around there, blowing bubbles and trying to work the whole business ashore again. And as soon as I got my feet on the bottom, I sung out for Archie, and I'll never forget yet, the old boy looked over his shoulder. He'd shot one of the partridges, looked over his shoulder, and he turned around and shot the other before he would come and give me a hand. However, at supper time that evening, I was glad he'd done so. Those partridges taste pretty good.
And when you people went in hunting, went into furring, for instance, when you went in the fall, how long were you gone? When did you go in?
Well, some of the trappers went in October, September. Some went in October and like that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Different. You know. The ones went to the Grand Falls, and they left there in about around 10th September, and the ones with Closter went in October, you know, middle of October.
And you were in them until when?
Oh, until some came back Christmas. Some never came back on around the middle of January and February.
Mm-hmm. How would the women make out when all the trappers were gone? Because you say when you were here then in those years, there was no more than half a dozen communities, for instance, half a dozen families. How did the women make out when all the trappers went hunting?
Oh, they didn't do very much. Keep them busy carrying the wood for the night and bringing water.
So what would happen in case somebody getting sick, you know, and all the men were gone?
Oh, well, they didn't used to be too much of that. The only sickness I know about was the flu, and everybody was pretty much home when the flu broke out, and that was in 1917, I think. But there was a doctor here, then Dr. Paddon, they was here. They helped a lot, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It's clear that I don't mind about many people sick or that, but when we're up in the country, we never get sick at all anyway, you know, only if you eat too much.
And that was mostly because of your own cooking.
Yeah.
Now, the women had to fish for themselves, more or less, when you people were gone in on.
Oh, yes, they, you know, there was always a few children. There was no schools or anything. If you had a child who was big enough to fish, you could take a hook and go off along shore someplace and get a trout, you know. And then perhaps a woman would go off and kill a few partridges.
There was no schooling?
There was no school, not in my time.
No. Then how did you people get the education as the years came down too?
Oh, after so many years, there was a teacher used to came here from some part of Newfoundland. She'd have a wick here and a wick Mud Lake and a wick Mulligan and a wick Pearl River and a wick Eddie Grand Lake and a wick Butter and Snow and all these little places, a wick Gillisport. And by the time the wick was up, the time was there for the go out, you know.
Yeah. And that's how the education was getting those days?
Oh, yes, that's all, yeah.
And that's all you got?
Yeah, there was no church, you know. Not first long. They built an old church there, and then after a while they turned it to a dance hall, but they put up a new church, you know. But I can remember there's no church at all. The minister used to go around there and have service in your home, you know, once or twice a year.
Yeah, once in the summer, once in the winter?
Yes, mostly, yeah.
Now, when you people were in hunting and when you came back out, I suppose there was some kind of a celebration after you got back out, all the men got out?
Oh, yes. You'd have quite a party on New Year's, you know. That's the way company used to have some race and run and race, tug of war and, you know, shooting and running races and things like that for a day, you know, with some prizes up.
And then the big go-down dance at night?
Oh, yes, the big go-down till daylight. Big rabbit stew for supper.
Now, some of these songs that we were listening to a few moments ago, you said that you wrote one of those yourself. How did you people go with writing these songs? Just sitting on a tent at night and thought them out?
Oh, yes. Just sitting down and thought them out yourself, you know, and scrabble them out some kind of way. Oh, I could read a little bit, they're very little, you know, but I picked up gradually. I could read a little bit now, but not too much, you know. My father was quite a good reader, and my mother, she was a very poor reader, you know, but she never went to. Father got a little bit of school from some place, or I don't know really too.
Now, where'd your parents come from, Mr. Montague? Now, I noticed in one of these songs that they were saying that they worked in their traps from morning until night. This must have covered a few miles, I guess, eh? But how many miles would you cover in a run of a day?
Oh, when you were going on working at your traps, you don't go very far. You go about 6-8 miles a day because you've got a lot of stoppage, you know. The traps are close together and you've got to stop the traps and fix them all up and that. Or if the going is good, sometimes you want to go up to Eddie Grand Lake and walk down there for a dance, so it's 40 miles. It's no short at all. I'm coming on 40 miles to a dance.
Is that right?
Oh, yeah, no short. Dance all night and go back in the morning.
That's when you fellows were young fellows, wasn't the girls were down there?
About 18 and 17, but there were no girls, only 2 or 3 in the place, you know.
Because everybody
But when you go, you walk 40 miles to see a girl or something like that.
Then you go back hunting them again the next day?
Oh, yes, go back again next day.
Yeah. And you're saying that the minister only came once or twice a year, once in summer, once in the winter. This was quite inconvenient for weddings and stuff like that. Wasn't you have to wait till the minister come around? He came here once a year?
Twice a year.
Yeah. And if you decided to get married, you had to wait till he came around.
Oh, yes, no sweat, though.
Now,
Oh, yes, there's another story. There's another one. Everybody wants to know this story I had of the experience of shooting the bull. Well, I tell you this one in short, too. The Grenfell Mission down at Northwest River had a head of cattle, about 8 or 10, and they lost their bull. And some wealthy farmer, it seems, in the United States gave Dr. Paddon a very thoroughbred bull. And he had it brought down here that fall, and Dr. Paddon and his wife were going out that winter for their furlough, and he asked me if I would help Mr. Watts with my boat to bring up the freight from Rigolette to Northwest River. Their boat had landed at Rigolette, and she was late in the fall, and she had to go back to do other work. So I was glad to do it, and Jack and I made some trips and brought up all the freight. And the last trip we had, we brought the bull. This great, big, thoroughbred bull. And the glad tidings then, this is the second glad tidings, she had an open cockpit. And the bull sort of fitted down very tightly into that open cockpit with the head out over the one side and the tail out over the other. And we started up from Rigolette, and it was a beautiful day up the bay. Jack and Ira Best was with us, and Jack and Ira was taking the ducks that came around the head of the boat, and I was at my gun in the back of the boat, taking the ducks to come around the back of the boat. We always kill a lot of ducks coming up in the fall year for winter supply of food. And I went along aft. I was engineer at the time. I went along aft to look at the engine to see how, and I moved the gun as I did. Sling goes the down, a double barrel, 12 gauge. Belonged to Sir Wilfrid Grenville that I had borrowed from. And it went through, the load went through the paunch of the bull, right into the paunch of the bull. Well, I went along, opened the galley door, the door, and went along to the wheelhouse where Jack was. I said, Jack, I shot the bull. You didn't. He said, yes, boy. He told me after that he knew that I did because I was white as a ghost. Ira and I and Jack went along, and we had a little conference there, what to do. There was this bull. It was eating some turnip peelings and cabbage. We were cooking a meal of pork and cabbage, as we Newfoundlanders like so well. And we had a little conference there, what to do. At last, the bull began to look sick, and we knew the only thing to do was to finish it off. So we had nothing on board. We had a tomahawk and a carving knife from the galley. And so Jack took the tomahawk, and I took the carving knife, and I lashed the bull's legs together, 2 forelegs and 2 hind legs, and had it so we all ready to reeve them up, so that if anything had happened, because this big bull took charge, we'd have a terrible time. And together we finished the bull off anyway, and put a piece of canvas over the carcass in the bottom of the boat, and started up the motor again. It's a beautiful day. Started up the motor and came onto Northwest River. Just about dark, we arrived in the river, and the people down there wanting to see the bull. They said, Mr. Watts, where's the bull? Jack says, back there sleeping. Oh, we'll let it up to once. We'll let it get up to once. So we had a loop around its head. And I told them to pass down the whip from the wharf, and we hooked the whip into the loop, and told them to go up on the winch, and this bull nose hoist up so limp, up and up and up, and plunk, and on the wharf. Well, everybody, not a word, and then of course we had to explain. Mm-hmm. To finish it off, the interesting thing about the post-mortem of it all was we had an English girl there that year who was an artist. Very fine artist. So she painted a picture. The Grenfell Mission Wharf is 150 or so many feet long. And she painted a picture of all these cows coming down the wharf with tears dropping down their eyes and a dead bull on the end of the wharf. Dr. Curtis, they tell me, was the medical officer of the Grenfell Mission in St. Anthony, had that picture in his office he died last year, and I don't know what happened to the picture, but that's the story of my shooting the bull. I'm an expert in killing the bull.
Liquor was a thing that was practically unknown then. Sure, there'd be maybe 2 or 3 kegs of homebrew somewhere around the village, but very few people ever became disorderly or objectionable. Once in a while you might notice that 2 or 3 were mildly exhilarated, but I think you very rarely in those days saw anybody who had enough to drink so that it did any more than contribute to the general fund for everybody. They were very careful not to drink enough to make spectacles of themselves.
This was home brew, you say, I think?
Yes. Usually spruce beer.
This was made by the local people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you have any idea how they used to make it then? I mean, do you have any?
Oh yes, used to make it myself, Gordie. The old-fashioned spruce beer that the trapper made. There were sort of 2 schools of thought on that, as there are on most things. Some people favored making it with molasses, some with white sugar. I belong to the white sugar school myself, and it's so long since I've made any, I don't remember the exact proportions now, but in general what you did roughly was to pick a good bundle of the very tender young tips of the black spruce, and you steep this for 20 minutes or so in boiling water. If you actually boiled it, it became bitter, but just steeped in water that had been brought to a boil, you got a a nice tangy, sprucey taste without any bitterness. Well, after you took the brush out of the water, you put the water into a keg with, as I remember, roughly a pound of sugar to a gallon of water, a yeast cake, and usually some rice or grain of some sort to add the fermentation process, and let it stand in a warm place for, I think, roughly 4 or 5 days. And then you corked it up and let it sit for 2 or 3 more days, and then it was ready to drink. It didn't take long to make it. If you let it stand too long, it got stronger. It also got less pleasant tasting. Most of us used to make it fairly mild and enjoy the good flavor as much as the strength.